I'm not going to talk about techniques. I'm going to talk about things we've done, but hopefully that will illustrate the techniques and be interesting to people. Let's see if we can make this work. Oh, I see. Yes, there we are. Engineering digital health ecosystems. So what ecosystems mean in this case is not just the technology, but the people plus the technology. And the reason for thinking about that is that you hear things like this regularly. I don't know that this is actually true, and I don't know who first said it, but many people point out that behavior has a lot to do with health. If you eat the wrong things, if you don't take your medicine, if various other things happen, you get problems. And recently, we've had a number of fairly large failures in trying to design systems that take human behavior into account properly. So good examples of this are during the pandemic. People failed to get vaccinated. They did things that got them sick, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, recently we've had a number of things in finance, which might be relevant, where crowd behavior of humans caused problems in financial digital systems. There's just a couple of examples. I like the quote from the CEO of Lehman Brothers when it failed. Said, we had a 26 standard deviation event here, which is, of course, ridiculous. Nothing is 26 standard deviations. What it means is his math wasn't right, and he didn't consider long-tail distributions and the fact that human behavior can be synchronized, and the equations just didn't account for that, and so you get things that are way out of the norm. And of course, we have a number of other long-term challenges that we need to address, which are typically things not just of the technology, but of human behavior mixed with the technology, often in unfortunate ways. So that's what we want to think about today. And I want to start off by just giving you a very simple example. This is a static snapshot example, which is not the right way to do it, but in this particular case, it's probably okay. So imagine that we had, on a census block basis, so this, sort of areas that are half a kilometer on a side, something that's a typical census area in most countries. And imagine that we knew where people worked on average and where they went to shop, and so the mixing of people. And we can consider this static because it doesn't change that quickly. What could we have done with that during the pandemic? Well, this is an example of something that we just published, just a very simple thing. The causal process is people get other people sick by infecting them, okay? Now, there's lots of other things going on, but let's just do a first-order analysis of asking where are the flows that happen where sick people are making non-vaccinated people sick. And let's vaccinate there, the people that are flowing, right? So it's not what happened, for instance, in the United States, is people said, well, we're just trying to vaccinate everybody or randomly as much as we can, or focus on communities that are least vaccinated or most deprived. If you do the network centrality, which is the sort of connectivity within the network of flows, you get twice the performance. And incidentally, it benefits the most poorest parts of the community the most, because they tend to be the ones that are left out of this. And in fact, if you optimize over this, using fairly standard optimization techniques, you can get almost a 10% improvement. So if you spend 1%, if you have 1% of a budget to increase your vaccination, if you spend it on the connectors in society, you'll get a 10% bang. If you send it on people who are just randomly, you get a 2% bang. Seems like you maybe ought to do this. This is taking human behavior into account. And what happened at the beginning of the pandemic was that we began working with epidemiologists, and we discovered that epidemiology models didn't include humans. They included antibodies, they included infection processes, but not human behavior. And so over the last couple of years, we've helped the Centers for Disease Control in the US and so forth to begin to incorporate these things. And hopefully they'll be able to do better next time around. And we actually are beginning to add information about flows to the US Census, which is, if you know anything about large bureaucracies, this is a miracle, right? Here's what I take to be sort of the fundamental problem. You want to be able to take dynamic human behavior into account. So dynamic human behavior here is the thing that I'm going to think about most are cascade behaviors. So, fads, panics, the sort of thing that brought down Silicon Valley Bank or Lehman Brothers, where you get these coordinated behaviors because people are copying each other. Now, most of the math that we use in economics and other sort of areas assumes that people are limitedly rational and that they're individual. In other words, they make up their minds for themselves. Okay? So that means you can approximate them as being independent processes. Right? But think about that. That means that they don't talk to each other. Now, I talk to other people, so do you. You wouldn't be here if you weren't talking to other people. So we have to consider what happens when there are social cues, when there's other people making choices and I get to observe the other people, okay? Because that demonstrably changes my decision processes. So I'm no longer rational in this particular sense, which is a deductive process. I know the facts and I make deductions to come up with actions. Now I have this other thing where I'm making deductions, but I'm taking into account social clues. And what we've done in the last couple of years is look for good models that can be used in analytic solutions for this. And it turns out that this very simple model isn't bad at all. And I'll show you some evidence about that. So basically, you're still limitedly rational, but now you incorporate a prior probability into your decisions that has to do with the frequency with which you see other people take actions and the results of those actions. Okay? So you say, well, this is a very different sort of stance. This is an abductive stance, where what you're saying is, I don't have all of the information. What I'm going to try and do is look at my own actions to figure out what's going on, what's causal, and I'm going to look at other people also. And I'm going to incorporate that in my reasoning. And because I don't know all the details of the other people, I can't incorporate that as a really fine-grained process, but I can incorporate it as a prior. And that's often called social exploration. It's abductive reasoning. And if you incorporate other people correctly, which genetics and evolution seems to have aided us in doing, you get something that is a fairly robust abductive reasoning network, which allows you to explore for causal processes in a fairly robust way. And we published this a couple of years ago in Cognition, which is sort of the leading cognitive science journal out there. So at least has some chance of being true, right? So we've also said, well, does this a nice model? It's good cognitive science. Does it actually work in the real world? So we convinced 2,000 finance experts. These are people that handle between $10 and $100 million a day in finance, okay? And we convinced them to pay us to run an experiment. We called this an online class, okay? So they paid us. We experimented on them. Good deal. And what we asked them to do is predict commodity prices. And then what we did is we took the average, the histogram, of those commodity predictions, and we showed them to people and asked if they wanted to redo their prediction based on what other people did. Okay? Some of them did that. Some of them moved their predictions substantially based on the crowd. Others said, no, we understand the numbers, we understand it, we're just going to do it. The people who are more quantitative, which is the sort of typical behavior you see in modeled in economics, actually made a little bit more money, but they were more risky. When they blew it big, okay? The people who were more social had a little bit lower risk, a lower return, but they had much lower risk. In fact, their Sharpe ratio was better, and I will go with the people who are social, okay? Because it's a repeated trials game, and so what you want to do is you really particularly want to minimize really bad mistakes. And that's, you can see that in this journal entropy. So that's pretty good. In fact, what these people do, the amount that they use social information forms a nice Pareto frontier. It's not bad. It's like pretty data. You can also do this with day traders. These are people who have an average about $10,000 in trading commodities, fiat currency, things like that. And what you find there is that people aren't that good. They top out, they have real limited reasoning powers. But what you can do is you can analyze what they're doing and what the crowd is doing and make suggestions to them about things they hadn't considered. And if you do that, which is sort of an obvious thing to do, they do it. They make more money. But they still top out around 10, 12 strategies because we just can't think about more than that, apparently. So this model, if you look at it as a network phenomena, it's a cooperative, distributed bandit problem. So bandits are things where you go into a casino and you decide what slot machine to pull. So we have a lot of things we can do in the world. We have to decide which ones to do based on what we've seen. And a cooperative one is where everybody's like looking at what everybody else is doing and saying, hey, this seems to work really well, so I'll do that too. Now, the thing that's different to that is from the traditional individual model is individuals have much greater inference power because they have a lot more examples. There's nothing magic here, right? It's asymptotically a minimum regret strategy, assuming that the learning is properly distributed. You can make that learning biased in ways that cause problems, and I'll get to that in just a minute. And the part that I'm particularly interested in is it gives you much greater ability to deal with non-stationary and long-tailed environments like the Lehman Brothers, right? Or Silicon Valley or things like that. So it has some interesting properties. And the math for this is this kernel methods for cooperative bandits that we had in ICML, which is the big machine learning thing a couple of years ago. However, when you introduce this social learning into a process, you now have the potential for getting cascades. Like if everybody does something, you're very likely to do it also. And that can propagate across the population. And it's particularly bad when you get elements in there that have large visibility within the community, so loud voices that everybody's copying. Okay? If everybody's learning from Joe and Joe does one thing and then makes a mistake, everyone will tend to make the mistake. Much more than you would imagine. And you will get actually cascades out of this type of unequal performance. And we have that in a PNAS paper. I'll show you in just a second here. So this is the National Academy of Science, so it's very, very cool. And of course, you could get echo chambers if you don't learn from enough people, or the people you learn from are very narrow. And what's really interesting, and should bother a couple of people in this audience, is that the fundamental welfare theorem of economics does not hold when you have unequal communications. So an awful lot of the regulation and policy we do, a lot of the investment strategy we do, assume that competition will result in a nice equilibrium state. And that's not true in something where you have social learning and you have unequal communication or fitness capabilities. So we can talk more about that, but you should go home and think about that and then look at your portfolio. One of the things that this type of social learning does is it induces community structure. And the reason is that if I'm going to learn from people, I want to learn from people who are like me and have the same utility function, right? I don't want to learn from people who are interested in things that I don't care about. That does me no good. In fact, that could be a negative. And so, again, another National Academy of Sciences paper shows that people will adapt based on evidence to learn most from people who seem to have the same utility function. And you can describe that, and of course we have the math of that as well. What that means, though, is that people's behavior is a function of the people they hang out with. Okay? Well, your parents maybe told you that, right? And you said, ha, 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 parents, right? However, I will notice that we do not run our society that way. We segment people based on where they live, how old they are, gender, but none of those things are very strongly tied to behavior. We do it because we're able to do it, we have a census, but if you know where people hang out and who the other people are, what you find is you can predict behavior and disease 3 times better, 300% better. Because if you all hang out in the same place, you're going to tend to learn to eat the same things and exercise the same amount and wear the same. I mean, these habits are extremely predictable among the people you spend time with. They're much less predictable by demographics or by geography of where you live. And there's a paper in the ACM Transactions about that. So indeed, alcoholism. If you're going to look for alcoholism in San Francisco, there's only certain places you need to look. If you're going to look for diabetes, there's only certain places. You know, if you have a limited budget, go look here, because this is all the people, these people are all diabetic. Now, we don't know why. Right? This is not causal, okay? This is people learning behavior from each other. That seems to be what's going on. And in fact, it works everywhere in the world that we've looked at. In fact, it works well enough that when the Secretary General of the United Nations asked me to be one of his data revolutionaries, which has an interesting story attached to it, what we did is we came up with a scheme that uses census blocks and measurements on census blocks to be able to quantify the Sustainable Development Goals. So, you know, it's no good having a goal like, you know, sustainability or inequality if you can't measure it. And so how are you going to measure it given that individual data is private and protected and dangerous? Well, it turns out that because of this learning from each other business, you can do things on census blocks, you know, kilometer-sized sort of areas, and get a very good characterization of that population. And that's actually what census bureaus around the world are beginning to do, which is good. I think this is, in some sense, one of the biggest quiet things that's happened in the last decade. Because what we're doing here, by agreement of all these nations, is calculating a series of measurements, not just GDP, which these nations, these politicians, have decided characterize our quality of life. So these are, I mean, you may not buy this. I would have nits to pick about it. But basically, people have said, look, we can actually measure all the dimensions of life and use that to drive policy. That's an amazing thing to get people to agree to. They probably don't understand it. One of the things that is contributing here, I'll show you this because this was very profoundly affecting for me. The United States did a 20-year study of 5,000 kids who were at risk. So these come from broken families, poverty, crime-ridden areas, and so forth. It's called the Fragile Family Study. They had social groups, study groups, university groups from all over the country study these children. I think they had 750 grants to study the children with the goal of trying to predict who was at risk, which child was at risk, and what interventions would work best. Okay, so these 20 years, 5,000 kids, each kid had 12,000 measurements made on them, because that's how many, like, they were poked and prodded all the time, right? And what do you think determines the quality of life for a kid growing up, whether they're going to be a successful citizen or not? Do you have your own ideas? The answer is you're wrong. None, zero, of the theories about child development, right, worked to any great power. Our group was like the best at predicting failure modes for the children, okay? You know, going to jail, failing to, et cetera. And the statistical power of it was pathetic. On the other hand, these community things rock. So there's a work by Roz Chetty, who's at Harvard up the river from us, showing that if a child is exposed to people that are sort of self-motivated and successful before they're 6 years old, that has about something like a 40% increase in their chance of being a successful adult. So it's as if children are being imprinted when they're very, very young to say, am I in charge of my future, or am I just a leaf blowing in the wind? What should I do to become effective and achieve my goals? And somehow they learn that before they're particularly verbal, right? And after that, it's all just letting the cement set. So there's the paper. It's Natural Academy of Sciences again. So based on this type of thinking, about 20 years ago, I was living in India and helping the government set up health services for rural nurses. So these are people that go around to each household, and they're typically women, typically 10th grade education, and they visit every home, and they visit all the women that are pregnant, and they try to help them out. And what we did is we built little digital tools that ran on cell phones, originally feature phones, and they're little AIs. And what they do is they talk about what's happening in the community and what are the bugs that the people in the community have. Like, does this community doing something that's stupid, basically, right? It's easy to do stupid things. There's lots of possibilities in the world. Like, in some areas, right, you have arsenic in the water. You probably shouldn't drink a lot of that when you're pregnant, okay? And that system, over the years, right, has served 450 million people. At one time, it was 10% of all births in the world. And it has now been taken over by various governments and so forth in 130 countries. The key thing here is that it's community AI. It's analyzing networks and behaviors in communities and using that as a feedback mechanism along with social pressure, right? So if you're pregnant and the nurse midwife comes to you, right, and says, you should do this, and you see the other women who are in your situation are doing that, you are far more likely to do it than if they just come to you, tell that, or if they send you a text that say, do this, right? So it's that sort of community feedback. And recently we have working with a Fortune 25 company who's in the health area to set up a worldwide network of clinics that are based on this, what they call scaled localism, been able to demonstrate 20% greater medical adherence. This is for things like diabetes and other sort of chronic diseases, and 25% fewer hospital readmissions. And since it's worldwide, it's going to be a lot of money. But this is exciting to me because this is an alternative to our existing healthcare system. Our healthcare system today is a sick care system, right? You go there when you're sick. This is something that is going to try and maintain health. So it's not doctors, it's nurses at most. It's everywhere, it's community-based, it's not centralized. And what we hope is that by using some of the AI frameworks that we've described, like this cooperative bandits, you can come up with better characterizations of strategies in each community and be able to do learning, private learning across communities. Because, of course, one of the things you can't do is move medical data around. It's private, it has to stay put. It's a national secret in many countries, so you can't move it out of the state. And so you need a framework for doing that, and we have a new book, Building the New Economy. Thomas is going to talk a little bit about that later this afternoon. To give you an idea of it, because I think this is relevant to where we're going, we are familiar with having controlled access to data while getting answers. So when you go in someplace and you give them a credit card or you use your phone, it gives you a routing number and the amount of money you want to spend. And that's sent by a network, MasterCard, UPI in India, places like that, to your bank or credit union, where at that point they say, oh, yep, he's got enough money or not, and then they send back yes or no to the merchant. Merchant doesn't know your bank account, doesn't even know your bank in many cases. Your data is not shared, but answers are at your request. That's key. So people have informed consent because they made the request for a particular service. It was then routed in a way that is obscured, so you can't see what's happening there, and then you get the answer back. No data sharing. And what we're talking about now is adding lots of other types of data to that. If you want to find out if somebody is vaccinated, for instance, it's not so relevant today, but it was a couple of years ago. You know, what you do is you put your phone up there. It would have a one-time routing number to the clinic that vaccinated you, okay? And the clinic would send back yes or no. That's it. They don't need to know where you were vaccinated, what you were vaccinated with, any of that other sort of stuff. They just get a yes or no under your control. Now, some countries, we've done a lot of this in the US, for instance. We helped Fidelity set up a system like this so that you don't have data sharing between banks when you move your accounts around. It used to be you would provide them with your login details. They would log into your bank account. They would then scrape the bits off the screen, really, and use that to determine that you were a good credit risk or not. Now what they do is they have attestations within a legal framework, and so there's no data sharing until the thing actually moves and the account moves off. In 2 years, it went from 0 accounts to 70% of all bank accounts in the US. We've done the same thing with Eurostat. Amusing stories there. And we're now doing things like this with France and Germany's health systems, turning them into these federated systems, and in Australia. And we hope to do this in other places as well. Some countries have figured out that this is a pretty good thing to do, not just for health data or money, but for everything. And that typically comes under the term Web3, which is sort of discredited at the moment, but really all it is it's local data stores plus distributed ledgers. Everybody has a ledger, everybody keeps their own data, they answer questions, okay? Sort of like the thing I just showed you with MasterCard, but, you know, for everything now, okay? And it's all encrypted. And we helped the Swiss, Alex was particularly helpful in this, setting up something that they do for medical data and money and other things. And if the Swiss do it, you should pay attention because it probably is real. You know? And then the other one where I'm visiting in a couple days is Singapore, where their sovereign wealth fund and JP Morgan helped them set up a thing called UBIN, terrible name, but it looks at transference of all sorts of data among all the different people that Singapore as a company, the sort of, you know, big family company talks to. Again, so it's called Web3. That puts a lot of people off. Just call it federated if you want to, or distributed ledger. Like I guess here you just set up a distributed ledger framework, whereas in Dubai it's a crypto framework, right? You're going to win here. We do a lot of work in this area. You can look at transformers.mit. So it's taking these large language models and making them private so that you don't share data, but you still get the advantage of it, and making them accountable using zero-knowledge proofs so that you can audit what happens in detail. And this is critical if you're going to do, for instance, climate change. You want to be able to audit all the carbon used and all the different people that supply you and the people you sell to. How are you going to do that? They're not going to give you their data, right? This is a general theme. No one's going to give you data. But what you can do is you can ask them to run a little program over their database, and that provides a proof, a digital proof, that they hit certain targets or did certain things. So they didn't share the data, they just shared a proof that they're real, they're audited. And that sort of thing is the way forward. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that. I want to there's a little bit of sort of kicker at the end here. How many minutes do I have left? 10, okay. What? 15, oh my God. So I could actually do this in detail, a little more detail. Oh, well, that's even better. Okay. I find that's the most interesting thing. So I've talked about being able to do collective learning with health data. So community data being aggregated. We think about this as a cooperative bandit problem where you've got communities all trying to make decisions about what works for them, and then you're aggregating this in a privacy-preserving way. I talked a little bit about doing that with financial data. You ought to pay attention to that because it's a good way to get data that you don't currently have, right? And that they normally wouldn't share with you. But there's other things you can do, and these are pretty exciting things that we have going. One is the sort of thing that we've been talking about is looking at networks of agents doing things and analyzing them for patterns of their dynamics and their evolution. Well, research is an example of that. So is commerce. And so let me show you an example of that. And then I'm going to show you one that's really, I think, really exciting, relevant to climate change and other things with RNA. Same math, basically. So this is science. This is sort of a high-level view of all the citations each paper makes of other areas. Okay, those little links are, you know, somebody in applied physics referenced somebody in electrochemistry. So there's a link, okay? So that's how we write papers, right? We write papers, we say, no, I like this guy was wrong. That's what we do. So this thing develops over time, right? This is a snapshot. But we can ask things like, you know, here's a little area that doesn't have very much. This is a sort of materials engineering. And how's that developing? Where's it going? Is it going to explode? Now, if you're a venture capitalist or an investor, you want to know this. When an area wants to develop quickly, when there's a breakthrough, you'd like to know, because you want to put resources in there. And today we do this heuristically. I can tell you, I've been on these committees. You get a bunch of old guys like me in a room and say, well, where's it going to go next? Oh, it's going to be this thing. Yeah, well, that process is just as good as it sounds. But an interesting thing you can do. So this is a snapshot of that little square. Let me go back, just so, because I didn't do that right. So here's a little square, citation world, okay? Now what we're going to do is we're going to map that citation world into a 40-dimensional space, and all these papers are going to be little things on the top. So this is like transformers do, or Word-Divec, things like that, okay? And here is the little star there. That's a paper that was published towards the end of, toward World War II about ferromagnetism. And it's a nice paper, but nobody ever references it because nobody's interested, okay? But if people began working in that area, suddenly they'd begin referencing it, right? So here's what actually happens. And you can see here, we're going to start in 1937 and we're going to go up to the present time. And the awaken means when the scientific community begins to get interested in this, and that poor lonely paper, the guy's already dead, right? Suddenly starts getting lots and lots of citations. So here we are, people are beginning to publish in the area, and now it really takes off. As that sort of yellow begins sort of encompassing it, that paper gets cited 1,000 times. So what's happening here, and this will repeat itself, right, is that there get to be a few papers, and then people think they want to go off this direction, but then they change their mind and they go off this direction. And when they finally go up that direction, they surround it, you get lots and lots of citations. Sort of cool. It's like an amoeba searching for food. And in fact, actually, the dynamics are like that, okay? So it's like this sort of little, it's actually a cooperative bandit problem. Not that you need to know that, but there you are. What's interesting is that this is the precision of predicting whether something's in the top 25% of all cited papers. The graph for 10%, top 10% is very similar. It's just a little bit lower. The two things at the bottom are preferential quality and how famous the author is, okay? But look what we're doing. We are predicting things to be highly cited in the top 25%, 20 years in advance. That's pretty good. It's better than a bunch of old guys getting in a room and saying, oh, I think this area is going to take off, right? Now, what's really interesting is you can do this for patents. Works pretty much exactly the same. Patents tail off after a few years, so they're not quite as good, but you can do it for law. Law is a citation thing. The judge says, you know, guy's going to jail, and that's based on this case, and this case. That's common law. Maybe you don't have so much common law here. We have that in the U.S. And you can predict which areas of law are going to be controversial, and therefore, which things are going to be cited a lot. So what does that mean? Well, that means is you can look at this relational data between scientific papers, patents, and law, and you can say, here's an area that's going to be big in science, people are jumping into it in terms of patenting, and it's safe in terms of law. Sounds like a good place to be interested. Yeah? Okay. Now this is the same thing, but now we're doing it with DNA fragments. So we all know about how wonderful RNA analysis and things is. The thing about those is that they're looking at a specific organism, like you, right, humans. When you look at a microbiome, and incidentally, most of the cells in your body are not human. There are other sorts of bugs in your gut and stuff like that. Or you look in soils. Right? There's all these little bugs in there. We don't know what they are. There are millions of them, and they're different in every different place, right? You can't, the techniques that we have don't handle millions of organisms, but what you can do is you can break them. This is the typical thing in RNA analysis. You break them into little short bits, okay? And if you know it's one more organism, then you can begin putting those short bits together. But if you don't know it's short bits, what you can do is you can find the relational structure between the short bits. So what you're pulling out is functional behavior of genetic fragments from millions of organisms over time. So which things sort of co-evolve, help each other. They may be in the same organism, they may not. You have no idea what the organism is. You don't care. But once you have this sort of map, what you can do is you can ask, well, let's see, there's something I'm interested in. So one of my former students, Yaniv Altshuler, did this. He went and he looked at longitudinal samples of microbiome of cows, because cows don't require human subjects' approval, and looked at the microbiome and did this. And he said, oh, look, some of these functional characteristics predict the relationship between foodstuffs that the cow eats and methane production. And so he's been able to double the effect of changing food stock to reduce methane. So going from the sort of best average treatment gives you about a 8% reduction. By just doing this, you can, and using sort of switching between different food stocks, you can now get something that's quite a bit better, and this is getting better and better. Okay, so it's something that, you know, okay, cows, right? But actually, if you could do this to all the cows in the world, which you're not going to, believe me, but if you could, that would be a couple % of all the global warming drivers. And I think that something that Professor Chu said yesterday was really interesting. You can imagine doing this in soils and asking them, you know, what combinations of little bugs produce more nitrous oxide? Because nitrous oxide is like this horrible greenhouse gas, right? And you could find combinations, functional combinations of RNA fragments that are associated with greater NO2 production or less, and you could try scattering them around, right? We don't know the functional connection yet, but almost certainly there will be. Same thing in oceans. You know, oceans are changing, the microbiomes are changing, as it were. You can begin to ask which things are healthy and which ones aren't, because now you can characterize these potentially functional relationships among all these bugs. So that's it. Wrote a couple of books. Building the New Economy is how you build software to do this. Social physics is thinking about people as community and not individuals. And there we are. And there's connection science. So thank you.
For Q&A.
I'll answer questions if we have time.
Yeah, we do have time.
Okay.
So do we have any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Has a question?
Professor Pentland, thank you so much for the amazing talk. My name is Anna Hambitza. I'm working here in Abu Dhabi in TII as a senior data scientist in the Cryptography Research Center. So I'm very interested all the data frameworks you presented to share sensitive and private data, like Eurostat and ICOIA. So do you see any missing and open topics to be tackled, or do you think data sharing is no problem anymore? We have everything.
No, so I pointed out this website, transformers.mit.edu. So data sharing is a huge problem. I mean, if you're going to build a better society, you need to be able to look at data, but nobody's going to give you their data. What are you going to do? And so there's a variety of techniques. Like Shafi Goldswasher will probably talk about homomorphic encryption, which is still pretty expensive. But there's a number of other techniques that are simple and available today. For instance, the things that MasterCard and Visa use aren't, I mean, they encrypt things, but it's actually the fact that they have a legal agreement that allows them to specify what they can ask and what to get answered and to audit it that is the thing that makes that go. And yet that's a way of getting at data across country boundaries, private data, for functional purposes. The new sort of zero-knowledge proofs are actually now efficient and reliable. And so if you look at transformers, you'll see some of that. And then we've come up with a new way of making large language models available for private data. So if you think about it, the thing that I react most negatively to with large language models is that they're centralized. People are building them with the mindset of Google. There's this thing, you give them your data, they give you back an answer, they know everything you're doing, right? Bad. What you'd like to do is you'd like to have something, particularly if you're a service company, where you can have a relationship with a client, you can have the client be accessing data with some of your tools, you can get all the power of the large language model, but you don't retain any of their data because you're going to go on to their competitor and provide services to the competitor. So we have ways of doing that now too. So some of these are actually new cryptographic techniques. A lot of them are sort of taking things and turning them inside out so that the way they weren't intended to be used, but actually turn out to be very useful. And you can sort of see our thinking there, basically. Okay.
Just to have it mentioned, TII published the world's best open source language model. Like it's between GPT 3.5 and GPT-4, and we are very proud of it.
Good, good. Well, and there's also something that we did called the Data Provenance Project. So what the Data Provenance Project is the largest open source data repository where there's metadata about the copyright status and other sort of legal aspects of the data so that you can train your model in ways that are comfortably safe from a legal perspective.
Yes. Joe? Joe, you have a question.
Thank you, Professor Pentland, for the wonderful talk. You showed a dynamical scatter plot within citation dynamics.
Yeah.
Can you describe what you have in the axis? I didn't get what you have in the axis of that scatter plot.
So what that is that's taking all the citation structures, it's a very high-dimensional structure, and boiling it down to a 40-dimensional space using a transformer-type architecture, right, like word-to-vec, that sort of thing. And then trying to ask about distance metrics on so all the articles are on that sphere, that 40-dimensional sphere, and then you can ask about the distance between articles on that sphere. So what you were seeing was a little piece of that feature sphere and seeing articles that were sort of crawling into that little piece of the feature space. Okay.
Why a four-dimensional?
It doesn't matter that it's 4D, not 4. It doesn't matter exactly that it's 40. It sort of works okay at 10. 100 is overkill. 20 is pretty good. The amusing story is we used every GPU in the state of Illinois for like a month, and we got our hands slapped for that. Right? But because it's a lot of data, and you know, it's a sort of high-dimensional problem, we probably didn't do it the best. But the point is that you're trying to sort of compress this so that you have a distance metric that has something to do with similarity of content, because we don't look at the content, we're just looking at the citations, right? And it turns out that 40 is not bad, 20 is okay, 50 is maybe a little better. Your mileage may vary. Okay?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure, we have a question.
Yeah.
I have a pretty loud voice. You know, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about how communities heavily influence whether or not you become diabetic, whether or not you become an alcoholic. Just look at the community. However, with the new generation of influencers, of people depending on their cell phones and looking at
Right.
influencers, would you say that the community is moving more from a physical location, as you indicated on your chart, more to a digital dependency on how they grow up? And if that is in fact happening, is there a way that we can give a, say, good housekeeping seal of approval to certain influencers to positively impact the next generation of people?
So clearly it's moving towards digital. The best evidence I see is it's still an order of magnitude difference between physical and online. I mean, if the people you hang out with think that you're acting stupidly, you really respond to that. If the influencer thinks you're stupid, you just get a different influencer, right? So there's that aspect to it. So that's a dynamic thing that's changing. But like, for instance, in voting behavior, you know, if someone shows up at your door, you don't know them, and says, you should vote for so-and-so, right? That is something like a couple orders of magnitude more effective than someone sending you email with the same message. Well, that's pretty interesting, okay? I have trouble with influencers anyhow. You remember I said there are error conditions when you have social learning? One of the error conditions is that some people have much louder voices than others. So their fitness in the sense of being able to convert people is much higher. In that case, they start a dynamic and they can grow without bound to dominate the entire discussion. And in that case, the fundamental welfare theorem fails to hold. In other words, you cannot have a community discussion that's productive, period. Okay? So what can you do about that? Well, there's a bunch of things that I like. It's like, for instance, you could tax people or make them pay fees based on how many followers they have, right? And what you'd find is, you know, you'd get more subscription, less advertising. You wouldn't get people with 10 million followers for cats, right? They would, you know, only be a few hundred or something like that. And the discussion should be, by the math, much more productive as a whole. Okay, so there's a bunch of things like that you can think. That's just one suggestion for how to fix it. But I have problems with the whole idea of influencers, because what we've done is we've taken the friction out of communication, and we have a preferential attachment domain where, you know, the popular get more popular. And what that means is the dynamics of that, this is this National Academy of Sciences paper, the dynamics of that are unstable. So you're going to get domination by just a few voices, and so you're not getting input from most people, you're not getting reflection, all the things you would want for sort of discourse, and all the things assumed in the fundamental welfare theorem don't hold. So bad. Okay.
Sure, we have one more question.
Oh, okay, good. Sir.
Professor Pentland, thank you for your speech. I actually wrote my question, so I wouldn't forget it. And it is on the same matter where you spoke about the effect or the ability to study categories based on the society or the environment. Taking a step backward, I think the society or the surrounding is the creation of people. for example, for the diabetic example, we chose to create in the society fast food restaurants in this area, which led to this diabetic example.
Yeah.
So my question would be, isn't it a loop? Don't we become isn't it a loop where we become what we create in the first place?
Yeah.
Studying that behavior is the effect.
So the way I think about it, right, is that there's this process that goes on continually. It's a dynamic process of deciding what is proper behavior, what's lawful, what's not lawful. It's a community process that comes from this sort of copying people, talking to people, et cetera, okay? And in the presence of powerful voices, it can go really badly awry. It's also abductive reasoning. We don't know a priori what sort of foods are going to end up being bad, what sort of patterns are going to be bad. We have to experiment. And we do, and if we can't have sort of good feedback about the results, we can end up in really bad air conditions. So, you know, with fast food, it was the solution to something, you know, which is the need for moving faster, for cheap food. It turns out most people eat fast food where they work, not at their home. It's a paper that's coming up in PNAS very soon. You know, so we invented something, and now we're beginning to find that it's wrong. But even with the community, like the whole country, having certain laws and things, different communities behave differently. And those are social pressure. You choose to go to certain places. You choose to hang out with other people. When you do that, you try to fit in. You try to have friends. You try to learn from them, so you become more like them. Like when we've done things like ask, can we predict what apps are on your phone? Okay? If I know the people you work with, I can do something like 5 times better than chance across the population. Okay, it's the same type of a thing. As you learn from people, you have to be collaborative with people, and so forth. So it's a continuous thing, and it can change because it is continuous, unless you have overly large voices, right? In which case, those voices will tend to dominate all the decision making. The way people, I mean, I run a thing called law.mit.edu. So law is actually done incorrectly in a really basic way. So we have this notion of law, that's good, but we have the notion defaultly of law as eternal. Laws don't expire, typically. They're supposed to be forever. But society changes, and the law becomes less appropriate in some cases harmful. And so one can imagine having law that evolves with the society in some way. I don't know how to do that. You know, I have ideas, but you don't want to hear them because they're half-baked. But what we need to do is we need to think about having intelligent processes for creating and modifying laws to match circumstances, right? And you see a little bit of this. You see this in zoning. You see it in traffic control. You see it in some financial things where essentially the law is parameterized by the behavior. And so that's sort of like getting your feet wet just a little bit at a time with law. And I don't mean to rag on about law. It's just an example of something we do wrong because we don't recognize that the situation is non-stationary. We don't recognize that behavior is not independent. It's cascade behavior that we indulge in, or not indulge in. It's how we get smart, learning from each other, right? And that induces the potential of cascades.
Thank you, sir.
One more question here?
One more question, yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. Saud Hussein Marzouki. I am an Associate Data Scientist at Emirates MED. I have 2 questions. Excuse me if they might seem a bit low level. But first, the gentleman over here talked about different types of communities, online communities, and specifically influencers. That sparked a question in my head. Was there any study done on different types of communities and how effective they can be in someone's decision. Let's say
Sure.
Reddit in the case of Wall Street bets. I think a lot of finance people here would be interested in that. So was there any exploration of that? And the second question is, does the effect of communities, or was that magnitude studied across cultures, or was it done primarily in the US?
Well, the thing that I referenced was a National Academy of Science paper, which just talks about the math of it, in a preferential attachment domain, which is anything that has likes and follows, okay? You get these cascade behaviors and real problems. So the thing of getting these bad behaviors is the violation of fundamental welfare theorem of economics. That's what you're seeing there. Alex and I just wrote a thing about Silicon Valley Bank and GameStop and how these sort of cascades on the digital world can influence real-world behavior. And we design our regulations as if the world were static and as if people's decisions were independent. But they're not, right? You get cascades because of the communication, and the regulation assumes that that can't happen. Right? And so we've looked at this in many different cultures. This seems to be my guess on this, and I'd be willing to sort of like fight and defend it, is that these are pretty basic human properties. We all learn from each other. We all learn pretty much the same. We're not that different. What we believe is different, but how we learn and how we sort of change our behaviors seems very, very similar. There are gain knobs. Right? So, for instance, Eastern cultures, by which I mean like Japan, China, things like that, tend to be much more community-oriented. So the gain knob on paying attention to what other people do is higher. Western cultures tend to be less that way. So, from a mathematical point of view, that means that the Eastern cultures are more stable but change more slowly. The Western cultures can change very quickly, but they get these, cascade behaviors that are really damaging. And individuals during their lifetime change too. So typically people are much more exploratory when they're in their 20s, and then they become less so. Interesting thing is that it seems that one of the processes by which kids fail, become basket cases, is if you have trauma when you're young, repeated trauma, you learn not to try new things. If you learn not to try new things, you don't learn new things, and that's a recipe for failure. Right? So.
Well, thanks so much. I was going to ask about the momentum, but you already answered that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.